Oh, by the 7 moons of Arcturus, what in the name of cosmic dust was that thing walking into our pristine council chambers? Chancellor Quarth's crystalline form practically vibrated with amusement as his multiple eyes focused on the creature that had just entered the Galactic Defense Summit. The being wore what could only be described as the most pathetically simple garment he had ever witnessed in his 3 centuries of diplomatic service. Is that supposed to be a uniform? Admiral Nexus whispered, his energy-based form flickering with what could only be described as barely contained laughter. Look at those ridiculous brown, what do they call them, boots? And that drab green fabric. Do these humans not understand the concept of ceremonial dress? General Rex clicked his mandibles in that particular way that indicated supreme disdain. His insectoid features twisted into what passed for a smirk among the Kandorian species. Perhaps they could not afford proper attire, he buzzed, his compound eyes glittering with malicious humor. I have seen cargo haulers dressed more impressively than this Riley MacKenzie, was it? The human in question walked with measured steps, her spine straight, hands clasped behind her back. Those blood-stained boots, and yes, they were definitely stained with something dark and rusty, made soft thuds against the polished floor of the council chamber. Her uniform bore small metal rectangles and cloth patches that seemed utterly meaningless to the assembled alien dignitaries. Those tiny metal decorations, Quarth observed, his voice dripping with condescension, are they supposed to impress us? My hatchlings receive more elaborate trinkets for completing basic education modules. Commander Riley MacKenzie said nothing. She simply took her assigned position at the speaker's podium, her pale human face betraying no emotion whatsoever. Her hands, Nexus noted with growing amusement, were scarred and calloused. How utterly primitive. Advanced species had long ago evolved past such physical imperfections. Perhaps, Rex suggested loudly enough for the human to hear, we should have sent her a memo about proper diplomatic attire. Though I suspect their species lacks the intellectual capacity to understand fashion protocols. The human's eyes, those strange, small orbs that somehow managed to track movement with unsettling precision, swept across the assembled aliens. Still, she remained silent, patient, waiting. How wonderfully naive these creatures were, Quarth mused, standing there in their pathetic little costumes, thinking they belonged among the galactic elite. This was going to be thoroughly entertaining. Now, to be completely fair, and Quarth prided himself on fairness, nobody had expected these humans to amount to anything significant when they first stumbled into galactic society. That had been what, 15 standard cycles ago? Admiral Nexus still told the story at diplomatic gatherings, usually after consuming sufficient amounts of liquid entertainment. There we were, Nexus would begin, his energy form pulsing with remembered amusement, conducting routine surveys of the outer spiral arms when we detected these primitive radio transmissions. Actual radio waves. Can you believe it? We thought we had discovered some sort of archaeological site. The first contact team had been thoroughly underwhelmed. The humans possessed no energy weapons, no plasma technology, no antimatter propulsion systems. Instead, they wielded crude kinetic projectiles, little metal pellets propelled by controlled chemical explosions. It was like watching children play with slingshots while standing next to a fusion reactor. Soft, emotional creatures had been the official assessment filed by the Cytherian contact specialists. Excessive water content, inefficient muscular structure, primitive sensory apparatus. A notable tendency toward irrational emotional responses when threatened. General Rex had contributed his own analysis after observing human military exercises. Their warriors. He had buzzed incredulously, actually cried during combat. They leak saline solution from their optical organs. How are they supposed to maintain tactical awareness while their own biology betrays them? The galactic community had tried, really tried, to understand human military doctrine. Top strategic minds from 17 different species had studied human conflict records, attempting to decipher some hidden brilliance behind their chaotic approach to warfare. The results had been disappointing. Humans apparently thought it was acceptable to charge directly into enemy fire while screaming incomprehensible battle cries. They would sacrifice valuable equipment and personnel for objectives that held minimal strategic value. Worse yet, they seemed to view their own survival as optional, which violated every logical principle of military engagement. They call it heroism, Korth had observed during one particularly frustrating analysis session. As if throwing one's life away for minimal tactical gain constitutes some form of virtue. But now, how the cosmic winds had shifted. The Void Swarm had appeared 6 months ago, sweeping through outer territories like some nightmare from the dark spaces between stars. These biomechanical monstrosities adapted faster than any species could counter them. Plasma weapons became useless after the first engagement. Energy shields were penetrated within hours. Antimatter explosives were absorbed and somehow converted into swarm resources. Every advanced military strategy had failed. The Kandorians' famous precision tactics, worthless against enemies that learned and evolved mid-battle. The Cytherians' energy manipulation techniques, the swarm simply adapted their frequencies. The Viridians' computational warfare algorithms hacked and turned against them within minutes. 3 core worlds had already fallen. 17 colonies had been consumed. The greatest military minds in galactic history stood helpless, while their technological superiority crumbled against this adaptive horror. And that, Korth reflected with growing unease, was why they had been forced to invite the humans to this emergency summit. Not because anyone believed these primitive creatures could succeed where advanced civilizations had failed, but because quite literally no other options remained. The irony was almost too delicious to bear. Almost. Yo. The holographic display in the center of the council chamber flickered to life, and suddenly the amusement died in every alien throat. The images were, well, they were absolutely terrifying, if Korth was being honest with himself, which he rarely was, but current circumstances seemed to demand a certain level of brutal self-assessment. At Kepler Station, once the pride of the Kandorian Military Engineering Corps, now resembled something a particularly deranged artist might sculpt from twisted metal and organic matter. The Void Swarm had not simply destroyed the station, they had transformed it into something that defied every principle of physics and good taste. The biomechanical entities, reported Colonel Thax, his usually steady Kandorian voice carrying just the tiniest tremor of barely controlled panic, have somehow incorporated our own defensive systems into their bodies. Our plasma cannons are now firing at us. Our shield generators are protecting them. Admiral Nexus's energy form dimmed considerably. How is that even possible? Our technology operates on completely different physical principles than biological systems. The quantum matrices alone should have prevented any form of integration. Tell that to the swarm, Rex clicked bitterly. They consumed the research station at Proxima 7 in less than 4 hours. 4 hours. We had 700 scientists there, along with our most advanced computational warfare systems. Now those same systems are being used to coordinate attacks against our remaining strongholds. The next set of images showed the fate of the Cytherian energy manipulation facility on Helios Prime. Korth had to admit, even he felt a certain queasiness watching those scenes. The swarm had not just adapted to the Cytherians' energy weapons, they had somehow learned to feed on pure energy itself, growing larger and more aggressive with each blast directed at them. Our antimatter warheads, reported Admiral Nexus with the kind of hollow tone usually reserved for funeral orations, are being absorbed and converted into raw material for their expansion. Every weapon we fire at them only makes them stronger. General Rex's compound eyes clicked shut in what could only be described as despair. The outer defense grid at Tau Ceti held for exactly 17 minutes. 17. We had been assured those fortifications could withstand a century-long siege. Commander Riley MacKenzie, who had remained silent throughout this recitation of galactic military failures, finally cleared her throat. The sound was surprisingly soft, almost polite, but it somehow cut through the rising panic in the chamber like a vibroblade through tissue paper. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying that peculiar human accent that always sounded vaguely primitive to alien ears. But I believe my government would like to volunteer our forces for the counteroffensive. The silence that followed was so complete that Quarth could actually hear the quantum fluctuations in the chamber's environmental systems. Then, slowly, like bubbles rising through thick liquid, came the laughter. "Oh, this is rich," Nexus wheezed, his energy form practically convulsing with mirth. "The humans want to help. With what exactly? Those charming little metal projectiles you call weapons?" Rex was clicking so rapidly his mandibles sounded like a percussion orchestra. "Commander MacKenzie, with all due respect to your species' enthusiasm, what exactly do you think kinetic bullets can accomplish against adaptive biomechanical armor that has already proven immune to plasma, energy manipulation, and antimatter weapons? Those primitive chemical explosives," Quarth added with barely contained glee. "What do your people call them? Gunpowder. Against entities that can incorporate our most advanced technology into their own biological matrix." "Really?" "Yes." Riley's expression never changed. She simply stood there, hands still clasped behind her back, watching the assembled aliens laugh at her offer. Her pale human eyes moved from one speaker to another, taking in their mirth with the kind of patient attention that should have been unsettling, but somehow wasn't. After all, what could possibly be threatening about a creature that leaked salt water when stressed? "You have to understand." Nexus continued, wiping tears of laughter from his energy-based optical sensors. "We are facing an enemy that adapts to our weapons faster than we can deploy them. These creatures learn, evolve, and overcome our technology within hours of first contact. What possible advantage could your kinetic projectiles provide? Those little metal decorations on your uniform," Rex added, gesturing with one of his forearms. "Are they supposed to represent military victories? Because I hate to break it to you, Commander, but the Void Swarm is not going to be impressed by whatever parade ground accomplishments your species considers noteworthy." Riley MacKenzie listened to every word, her scarred hands never moving, her posture never shifting. When the laughter finally died down to scattered chuckles and condescending whispers, she spoke again. "I understand your concerns," she said quietly. "And you are absolutely right about one thing. Our weapons are primitive compared to yours. But there is something you might want to consider before you dismiss our offer entirely." "Oh?" Quarth leaned forward, his crystalline structure refracting the chamber's light into amused rainbows. "And what wisdom might the human military possess that has escaped the greatest strategic minds in galactic history?" Commander Riley MacKenzie smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "The thing about fighting an adaptive enemy." Riley began, activating her own portable holographic display, a device so primitive it actually required physical manipulation with her fingers. "Is that adaptation requires patterns to analyze, predictable behavior to counter, logical responses to anticipate." She gestured to the display, which showed crude tactical diagrams that looked like they had been drawn by a particularly untalented child. "Your species fight with elegant precision." "Beautiful, really. Mathematical perfection in every maneuver, computer-calculated trajectories, optimal resource allocation, minimal casualties." Quarth's multiple eyes focused on the display with growing confusion. "Yes, of course. That is how civilized warfare is conducted. Maximum efficiency, minimum waste." "And that," Riley continued, her voice carrying a note of something that made Admiral Nexus's energy form flicker uneasily, "is exactly why you are losing." The hologram shifted to show recordings from human military conflicts. The assembled aliens watched in growing horror as primitive human soldiers charged directly into enemy fire, screaming incomprehensibly. Humans threw themselves on explosive devices to save their companions. Humans used their own bodies as shields. Humans fought with knives when their ammunition ran out. Humans bit their enemies when their knives broke. "What in the name of cosmic sanity are we watching?" Rex buzzed, his compound eyes recoiling from the display. "These creatures are deliberately harming themselves. We call it acceptable losses," Riley explained matter-of-factly. "Sometimes victory requires sacrifice. Sometimes the only way to complete the mission is to accept that not everyone is coming home." General Rex's mandibles clicked in absolute bewilderment. But that makes no logical sense. Every casualty reduces your overall combat effectiveness. Does it? Riley asked, advancing to the next set of recordings. Watch this engagement from the Terran-Martian Colonial War. My great-grandfather was there, actually. The display showed human forces facing overwhelming odds against better-equipped enemies. Instead of retreating or requesting reinforcements, the humans did something that defied every principle of military science. They split their forces, abandoned their defensive positions, and attacked from 7 different directions simultaneously. This is madness, Nexus whispered. They are violating every basic principle of tactical deployment. Exactly, Riley agreed cheerfully. And it worked. The enemy spent so much time trying to predict our next logical move that they completely failed to counter our illogical ones. She switched to more recent footage that made Quarth's crystalline structure actually crack with shock. Human soldiers were using their primitive kinetic weapons in ways that violated physics, common sense, and several treaties regarding humane warfare. They rigged explosives to detonate in patterns that served no apparent tactical purpose. They used their own equipment as improvised weapons when conventional ammunition failed. They created traps from materials that should not have been weaponizable. But how do you coordinate such randomness? Rex demanded. How do your commanders maintain any semblance of strategic control? Riley's smile grew wider. We do not. Field commanders are authorized to ignore orders if they think they have a better idea. Individual soldiers are encouraged to improvise solutions using whatever materials are available. We call it thinking outside the box. That is not military doctrine, Quarth protested. That is organized insanity. Is it? Riley asked, pulling up tactical analyses of recent Void Swarm engagements. Look at these attack patterns. The swarm adapts to your logical responses within hours. But what happens when there is no logic to adapt to? What happens when your enemy does something that makes no sense? The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. Admiral Nexus was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. You want to deploy forces that even you cannot predict. Precisely. Human soldiers trained for decades in the fine art of creative problem-solving under pressure. Warriors who view death as an acceptable outcome if it achieves the mission objective. Fighters who will use anything as a weapon if it gives them even the slightest tactical advantage. Within 3 standard hours, the first human combat units had been deployed to the contested zone around Beta Centauri. The alien observers expected to witness a massacre, primitive humans with their chemical-propelled projectiles facing biomechanical nightmares that had already adapted to the galaxy's most advanced weaponry. What they witnessed instead was something that would haunt their dreams for cycles to come. The human soldiers did not behave like any military force in recorded galactic history. When their kinetic weapons proved ineffective against swarm armor, they did not retreat or call for better equipment. Instead, they began using their weapons in ways that had never occurred to alien military scientists. They are firing at the ground, reported Colonel Thax, his voice carrying notes of hysteria. Not at the enemy, at the ground. Why are they firing at the ground? The answer became apparent moments later when the ricocheting bullets began striking swarm entities from completely unexpected angles. The creatures had adapted their armor to deflect direct impacts, but they had not anticipated projectiles that bounced off multiple surfaces before finding their targets. That should not work, Nexus muttered, watching human soldiers coordinate their fire to create what could only be described as kinetic chaos. The probability calculations alone. They are not calculating probabilities, Quarth realized with growing horror. They are simply firing at everything and hoping something works. And it was working. The Void Swarm entities, designed to adapt to predictable weapon patterns, found themselves facing projectiles arriving from mathematically impossible directions. Bullets that should have been deflected were somehow finding gaps in armor that adapted faster than any known technology. But the real shock came when human soldiers ran out of ammunition entirely. Instead of retreating, they began improvising weapons from battlefield debris. Chunks of destroyed swarm biomatter became clubs. Pieces of their own damaged equipment became explosive devices. Even their primitive medical supplies were somehow weaponized into chemical irritants that interfered with swarm sensory systems. "They are using their own blood as a weapon," Rex reported in a voice that barely qualified as a whisper. "They are deliberately injuring themselves to create biological hazards that disrupt swarm adaptation protocols." One human soldier, completely out of conventional ammunition and surrounded by swarm entities, removed her own helmet and used it as a blunt instrument while simultaneously activating a communications device that emitted feedback frequencies painful to swarm auditory systems. She fought with the helmet in one hand and the communications device in the other, screaming what sounded like ancient human war songs at volumes that registered as sonic weapons. "This is not warfare," Admiral Nexus observed with something approaching awe. "This is weaponized insanity." "And it is working," Korth added, watching swarm entities retreat in apparent confusion from human forces that refused to follow any known pattern of military behavior. The Void Swarm, designed to counter logical military responses, it had no algorithms for dealing with opponents who fought like rabid animals using whatever materials happened to be available while simultaneously laughing, crying, and singing at volumes that interfered with their sensory equipment. For the first time in months, alien observers were watching swarm entities actually retreat. The breakthrough came during the fourth day of human engagement, when something unprecedented happened. The Void Swarm began showing signs of confusion. Yes, confusion. Creatures that had previously adapted to counter every known weapon system in the galaxy were now exhibiting behavior patterns that registered as genuine bewilderment on the key monitoring equipment. "They are trying to adapt to human tactics," reported Colonel Thax, his compound eyes wide with disbelief. "But humans keep changing their tactics faster than the swarm can process the adaptations." It was true. While the swarm had successfully countered predictable alien military doctrine within hours, human forces were literally inventing new approaches to combat in real time. A tactic that worked for 5 minutes would be abandoned for something completely different before the swarm entities could develop effective countermeasures. "This morning," Admiral Nexus observed with something approaching wonder, "I watched a human squad use explosive charges to collapse a building onto swarm forces. Standard demolition tactics. The swarm adapted their structural reinforcement protocols accordingly." "And then?" Korth prompted, though his crystalline form was already gleaming with anticipated amusement. "Then the same human squad used the rubble from the collapsed building as projectiles, was launching chunks of concrete using improvised catapults constructed from salvaged vehicle parts. When the swarm adapted to kinetic bombardment, the humans started using the catapults to launch containers of industrial cleaning chemicals that reacted with swarm biomatter in ways that apparently caused significant discomfort. But the real turning point came when Commander Riley MacKenzie herself entered direct combat. The alien observers had been watching the engagement through remote monitoring systems, safely positioned several kilometers from the actual fighting. They expected to witness a primitive human commander making tactically sound decisions from a protected command position. What they witnessed instead was Riley MacKenzie grabbing a standard-issue human kinetic weapon and personally leading a charge into the heaviest concentration of swarm entities anyone had ever seen assembled in one location. "She is doing what now?" Rex clicked frantically, adjusting his monitoring equipment as if it might be malfunctioning. "The human command structure permits leaders to engage in direct combat." "Apparently so," Korth muttered, watching in fascination as Riley MacKenzie demonstrated why her boots bore those mysterious dark stains. The commander moved through the battlefield like something from an alien nightmare, but in reverse. Instead of being the monster that terrified others, she was the terrifying thing that monsters should have been afraid of. Her primitive kinetic weapon ran out of ammunition within the first 2 minutes of engagement. Her response was to use the weapon itself as a club while simultaneously drawing a backup weapon that fired different projectiles. When the backup weapon failed, she drew what appeared to be a sharpened metal blade, an actual blade, and began engaging swarm entities in close-quarters combat that violated every principle of sensible military engagement. "She is fighting them with a knife," Admiral Nexus reported in tones usually reserved for religious experiences. "A metal knife. Against biomechanical entities that have proven immune to plasma weaponry. And she is winning." The swarm entities kept trying to adapt to her attacks, but Riley MacKenzie kept changing her attack patterns faster than their biological systems could process the modifications. She would stab, then slash, then use the knife as a throwing weapon, then retrieve it and employ it as a prying tool to damage swarm joint mechanisms. When her knife broke, which it inevitably did, she picked up a piece of broken swarm carapace and began using that as a weapon. When that proved inadequate, she grabbed a chunk of battlefield debris and started bludgeoning her opponents with improvised tools while simultaneously calling out tactical instructions to her human subordinates. "Look at her boots," Korth whispered, his multiple eyes focused on the close-range scanner readings. "Look at what she is standing in." The monitoring equipment revealed that Commander Riley MacKenzie was literally ankle-deep in the mixed fluids of multiple swarm entities she had personally neutralized. Her primitive brown boots, those same boots the aliens had mocked hours earlier, were now completely saturated with evidence of close-quarters combat that defied every principle of civilized warfare. But she was not finished. When the largest swarm entity on the battlefield, a creature the size of a small transport vehicle, advanced toward her position, Riley MacKenzie did not retreat or call for support. Instead, she pulled something from her equipment harness, armed it with a series of mechanical clicks, and threw herself directly at the creature while activating what appeared to be a chemical explosive device. The resulting explosion was visible from the alien observation post several kilometers away. When the smoke cleared, Riley MacKenzie was still standing, bloodied, battered, her uniform torn and stained with substances that sensor analysis could not identify, but still standing. The massive swarm entity was not. She looked down at her boots, those ridiculous, primitive, blood-stained boots, and then looked directly at the alien monitoring equipment as if she knew exactly where the observers were positioned. Then she smiled that same unsettling smile she had worn in the council chamber. Within 48 hours of the Beta Centauri engagement, the galactic communication networks were flooded with requests that would have been unthinkable just 1 week earlier. The Kandorian High Command wanted human military advisors. The Cytherian Energy Council was requesting training programs in creative combat applications. Even the proud Viridian Computational War College was inquiring about exchange programs with human military academies. "Let me understand this correctly," Admiral Nexus transmitted to his superiors, his energy form flickering with what could only be described as bureaucratic exhaustion. "We are now paying primitive humans to teach us how to fight?" The answer apparently was yes, and the irony was not lost on anyone involved. General Rex found himself in the particularly humiliating position of taking notes while human sergeants, actual sergeants, explained the finer points of tactical improvisation to Kandorian strategic planners who had spent centuries perfecting the art of warfare. "The key concept," explained Master Sergeant Torres, a human so covered in scars that Rex initially mistook her for a walking medical emergency, "is that your enemy cannot counter tactics that you invent on the spot. If you do not know what you are going to do next, neither do they. But how do you coordinate such randomness?" Rex clicked frantically, his compound eyes straining to understand tactical doctrine that seemed to violate the basic principles of military science. "You do not coordinate it," Torres replied cheerfully. "You just trust your people to figure it out as they go along. Works every time." Chancellor Korth discovered that his centuries of diplomatic training had not prepared him for the experience of watching Viridian tactical computers attempt to process human combat recordings. The machines kept returning error messages when asked to analyze battles where humans had achieved victory through methods that registered as tactically impossible according to established military mathematics. Perhaps, he suggested to his computational specialists, we should consider that our mathematics might be incomplete. The specialist responded with the electronic equivalent of nervous breakdowns. But the most profound change was in how the Galactic community now viewed those primitive human uniforms. Riley MacKenzie's blood-stained boots were no longer seen as evidence of inferior equipment maintenance. They were recognized as proof of personal combat experience that no amount of advanced technology could replicate. Those small metal rectangles that had seemed so meaningless now carried weight that impressed alien military commanders who had previously dismissed them as decorative trinkets. Each ribbon and medal represented engagements where humans had faced impossible odds and somehow emerged victorious through sheer bloody-minded determination. Nexus observed during a recent strategy meeting, perhaps we have been approaching warfare from the wrong perspective entirely. We have been fighting to demonstrate technological superiority. While humans, Korth added with newfound respect, fight to win. Period. They do not care if their methods are elegant or technologically impressive. They care about achieving victory, regardless of the cost. The Void Swarm, designed to counter logical military responses from advanced civilizations, had encountered something they were never programmed to handle, an enemy that refused to behave logically, that treated warfare as a problem to be solved rather than a system to be perfected. And that would literally use anything as a weapon if it provided even the slightest tactical advantage. Most disturbing of all, from the Swarm's perspective, was that humans seemed to actually enjoy the experience of combat. They sang while fighting. They laughed while dying. They told jokes while bleeding. The Swarm's behavioral analysis protocols had no framework for processing enemies who treated life-or-death combat as some form of recreational activity. 6 months later, Commander Riley MacKenzie stood once again in the Galactic Defense Council chambers. The same chambers where alien dignitaries had mocked her primitive uniform and blood-stained boots. The same chambers where sophisticated species had dismissed human military capabilities as laughably inadequate. Now, however, the atmosphere was somewhat different. Chancellor Korth, Admiral Nexus, and General Rex sat in respectful silence as Riley delivered her after-action report on the successful elimination of the Void Swarm threat. Her uniform still looked exactly the same, simple, practical, functional. Her boots still bore the dark stains that marked her as someone who had personally engaged in close-quarters combat. But now, every alien in the chamber understood exactly what those stains represented. The elimination of the swarm threat required a total of 47 separate engagements across 16 different star systems, Riley reported in the same calm but professional tone she had used during their first meeting. Human casualties were within acceptable parameters. Mission objectives were achieved ahead of schedule. When she finished her report, the chamber remained silent for several long moments. Finally, Chancellor Korth cleared his vocal apparatus and spoke. "Commander MacKenzie," he said, his crystalline form reflecting what could only be described as embarrassed light patterns, "I believe I owe you an apology. We may have underestimated your species' military capabilities." Riley looked down at her boots, those same ridiculous, primitive, blood-stained boots that had once been objects of alien mockery, and then back at the assembled dignitaries. "These stains," she said simply, tapping her right boot against the polished chamber floor, "I earned this uniform." And for the first time in galactic history, an entire room full of highly advanced alien species found themselves feeling genuinely humbled by a creature wearing brown leather footwear and carrying kinetic projectile weapons. It was, Korth reflected, a learning experience they would not soon forget.